My name is Harper Sterling, and I am 31 years old, and for the last 6 years, I have existed as a ghost to the people who shared my blood and my last name. My father, Julian Sterling, is a man who built a $48 million real estate empire in Aspen, Colorado, on the foundation of two things: unwavering loyalty and a pristine public image. In the Sterling household, those two things were the only currency that mattered, and on a Tuesday morning in May of 2018, I was declared bankrupt. My younger sister, Chloe, who is now 28 and has always been the golden child of the family, told my parents that I had been expelled from the University of Colorado School of Medicine for selling prescription narcotics from the student clinic. It was a calculated, vicious lie born out of her own fear that my impending graduation would finally shift the spotlight away from her socialite lifestyle and onto my professional success. She didn't just whisper a rumor. She forged emails from the dean's office and planted a stolen bottle of oxycodone in my bedside drawer at our 5-bedroom estate on Red Mountain. When my father found that bottle, he didn't ask for my side of the story or wait for an investigation. He stood in the grand foyer under a $200,000 Swarovski crystal chandelier and looked at me with a coldness that froze the very marrow in my bones. He told me I was a failure and a stain on the Sterling name, and then he gave me exactly 20 minutes to pack a single suitcase before the private security team he paid $60 an hour to patrol the grounds escorted me to the edge of the property. I remember the sound of the heavy wrought iron gates clicking shut behind me, a metallic finality that echoed through the mountain air. I stood there on the asphalt with one suitcase and a shattered heart, watching my father change the security codes on the digital keypad from the window of his mahogany-paneled office. He blocked my number before I even reached the bottom of the hill, and my mother, who always chose my father's approval over her children's safety, did the same. For 6 years, I was erased from the family portraits, omitted from the holiday cards, and treated as if I had died in that foyer. But I didn't die. I worked. I moved to Seattle, lived in a 400-square-foot studio apartment that smelled like damp cedar and old radiator steam, and I finished my degree with honors while working 30-hour shifts as a surgical intern. I traded the sterling silver spoons for a stainless steel scalpel, and I built a life that had nothing to do with my father's millions. I became a lead trauma surgeon at Harborview Medical Center, specializing in high-velocity impact injuries. I learned how to stay calm when the world was literally falling apart in my hands, and I learned that the only person I could ever truly rely on was myself. My hands, once used to play Chopin on a Steinway grand piano in our Aspen living room, became instruments of survival, capable of suturing a ruptured aorta in a darkened operating room while the monitors screamed. I forgot the sound of my father's voice, or at least I tried to, until 3 weeks ago when the red emergency phone in the trauma bay began to ring at 4 o'clock in the morning. The paramedics radioed in a code blue Transit. A 28-year-old female victim of a high-speed rollover on I-5, massive internal hemorrhaging, grade 4 liver laceration, and a traumatic brain injury. They said she was a Jane Doe because her handbag had been tossed from the vehicle, but when the ambulance doors swung open and the gurney was rushed into Trauma Room 1, the world stopped spinning. Under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the bay, I didn't see a patient. I saw Chloe. Her face, which had been featured in countless Aspen social magazines, was barely recognizable under a mask of blood and road grime. Her skin was the color of wet ash, and her pulse was a thready, desperate flutter against my fingers. Behind the paramedics, 2 people were screaming in the hallway, being held back by hospital security. I turned my head and saw them, Julian and Evelyn Sterling. My father was wearing a $3,000 Brioni wool coat that was now stained with his daughter's blood, and my mother was clutching her throat, her designer heels clicking frantically on the linoleum. They looked older, more fragile, and utterly powerless. When my father's eyes met mine across the trauma bay, the recognition hit him like a physical blow. He saw the name Dr. Harper Sterling embroidered in navy blue thread on my white coat, and for the first time in my life, I saw him crumble. He tried to speak, his mouth working like a fish out of water, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned my back on him and focused on the dying girl on the table. I spent the next 7 hours inside a $600 sterile surgical gown, my feet planted on the floor of operating room 4, fighting the Reaper for the soul of the sister who had destroyed my life. Every time I reached for a clamp or a suture, I remembered the lies she told. I remembered the 5 years of missed birthdays, the graduation she skipped, and the way she laughed when I was kicked out into the snow. But as a surgeon, my resentment has no place at the table. I repaired her liver, I stabilized her shattered pelvis, and I managed the pressure in her cranium with a precision that only comes from years of redirected pain. When I finally stepped out of the OR, the sun was rising over the Seattle skyline, casting a pale gold light over the waiting room where my parents had been sitting for nearly 8 hours. They stood up simultaneously as I approached, their faces etched with a desperate, pathetic hope. My father stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back, maintaining the professional distance that he had taught me so well. I told them that Chloe was stable but in a medically induced coma, and that the next 72 hours would determine if she would ever walk or speak again. My mother started to sob, a high-pitched, warbling sound that echoed through the sterile corridor, but my father just stared at me. He whispered my name, his voice breaking, and asked if he could come to my office to talk. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I didn't feel the anger I expected. I felt a profound, hollow pity. I told him that my office was for hospital business and that he was currently a visitor in a facility where I held the authority. I reminded him that 6 years ago he told me I was a stain on his name, and yet here I was, the only reason that name still had a future. I told him that I wouldn't be blocking his number because I needed to be able to reach him regarding his daughter's medical status, but that once Chloe was discharged, the security codes on my life would remain unchanged. He tried to offer me money, starting at $100,000 as a thank you, as if my integrity could be bought with the same checkbook he used to erase me. I refused it. I walked away from them, the soles of my surgical clogs squeaking on the clean floors, and I went to the locker room to wash the blood of my family off my hands. In the days that followed, the power dynamic shifted in a way that was almost poetic. My father, the man who controlled boardrooms and real estate markets, had to ask my permission for everything. He had to wait in the cafeteria, eating $5 lukewarm sandwiches, waiting for my 10-minute updates. He had to watch me lead a team of residents, commands falling from my lips with a confidence he never thought I possessed. He saw the respect I commanded from my peers, and he realized that while he had been protecting a reputation built on sand, I had been building a legacy built on bone and muscle. He tried to apologize a dozen times, bringing up the medical school lie, admitting that he had found out Chloe had lied 2 years ago, but was too proud to call me and admit he was wrong. That was the most painful part, knowing he had let me suffer for 4 additional years just to save his own ego. Eventually, Chloe woke up. The first thing she saw when she opened her eyes wasn't our parents. It was me, checking her pupillary response. She tried to flinch, memory and guilt flooding back into her gaze, but she was too weak. I didn't say I forgave her because I don't. Forgiveness is a luxury for people who didn't have to rebuild their entire universe from scratch. I simply told her that she was safe and that she was going to recover. I watched as my parents rushed to her side, showering her with the affection they had withheld from me, and I realized that I didn't want it anymore. I didn't need the sterling millions or the house in Aspen or the approval of a man who values optics over his own flesh and blood. I am Dr. Harper Sterling, and I have saved the life of the person who tried to ruin mine. That is the only closure I require. Family isn't the name on your birth certificate or the person who pays your tuition. Family is a system of support that doesn't collapse the moment a lie is whispered. It is the people who stand by you when the security codes change and the gates lock. My father spent his life building walls to keep the world out, but in doing so, he locked himself in a very lonely room. I am finally standing on the other side of that wall, not as a failure, but as a woman who knows exactly what she is worth. The Sterling name might be on the side of buildings in Colorado, but in this hospital and in my own heart, it belongs to me. I stood on the helipad of the hospital that evening, watching the city lights flicker to life, and I breathed in the cold, honest air of a life I earned. I realized that the greatest revenge isn't seeing your enemies suffer. It's becoming someone they can no longer touch, someone whose value is so absolute that no lie can ever diminish it. My father can keep his millions and his estate. I have my hands, my skill, and a conscience that is as clear as the glass in an operating room. I am no longer a daughter of the Sterling Empire. I am the architect of my own. In the year 2018, the distance between my existence and the life my sister Mackenzie led was not just a difference in lifestyle, but a vast, echoing canyon of resentment and privilege that defined every waking second of my survival. My sister was what our social circle in Aspen called the Platinum Child, a title she wore with the same effortless arrogance as the $42,000 Patek Philippe Calatrava watch that glistened on her wrist every time she reached for a glass of vintage Cristal. While I was burying myself under the crushing weight of 100-hour work weeks as a surgical resident, Mackenzie was floating through a dreamscape provided entirely by our father's real estate empire, residing in a 3,000-square-foot penthouse in Soho, where the monthly rent was a staggering $15,000. That rent, along with her lightning-fast fiber-optic internet, her weekly floral arrangements from the most expensive boutiques in Manhattan, and her private Pilates instructor, was paid for by a single wire transfer from Julian Sterling's business account without him ever blinking an eye. Mackenzie claimed to be a lifestyle consultant, a vague and shimmering profession that mostly involved her taking high-resolution photographs of avocado toast and designer handbags for her 300,000 followers, while I was living in a 380-square-foot walk-up apartment in a crumbling building where the heater had been broken since the previous November. I vividly remember the nights when the temperature in my bedroom dropped so low that I could see my own breath hitching in the air, a pale ghost of my exhaustion, while I huddled under 3 layers of thrift store blankets and tried to memorize the intricate pathways of the human cardiovascular system. My only true luxury, the one thing that kept me from total psychological collapse, was a $4 cup of black coffee from the corner bodega that I allowed myself once a week on Tuesday mornings before my double shift began. I would stand on that street corner, feeling the steam hit my face, and realize that I was spending every single cent of my $62,000 annual salary on specialized medical certifications and exam fees, investing in a future that my family had already decided I didn't deserve. At the exact same time, I was calculating if I could afford a new pair of compression socks for the operating room, Mackenzie was spending $62,000, my entire yearly existence, on a single drug-fueled weekend in Ibiza, chartering a yacht and buying magnums of champagne for people whose names she wouldn't even remember by Monday morning. The contrast was a physical ache, a constant reminder that in the eyes of Julian Sterling, my labor was a hobby while Mackenzie's hedonism was a birthright. I remember calling my father during a rare 10-minute break between a trauma intake and a bedside consult, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep and my hands still shaking from adrenaline, just to ask if he could help me with the $2,000 deposit for my board certification exams. He didn't even let me finish the sentence before he sighed with a sound of profound disappointment, telling me that if I had chosen a real profession instead of playing doctor to the masses, I wouldn't be struggling for pocket change. He told me that Mackenzie was the one bringing prestige to the Sterling name by being a tastemaker in New York, while I was just a glorified technician who smelled like antiseptic and failure. That was the day I realized that my father didn't just love my sister more. He valued her emptiness more than my substance, because her life was a mirror that reflected his wealth, while my struggle was a reminder of the grit he had long ago traded for social standing. I went back into the trauma bay that afternoon and worked for 16 hours straight without a meal, the hunger in my stomach fueled by a cold, sharpening rage that I knew would eventually be my greatest weapon. I stopped checking Mackenzie's social media feeds where she posted photos of her walk-in closet filled with Hermes Birkin bags and Chanel suits, each one worth more than my car. And I leaned into the darkness of my tiny apartment and my massive textbooks. I learned to find a strange, masochistic pride in the fact that I was building a life out of nothing but my own willpower. While every brick in Mackenzie's penthouse was held together by our father's guilt and vanity. The bitterness of that period is etched into my memory like a scar, specifically the way the holidays felt when I was expected to show up at the estate in Aspen and pretend that I wasn't starving while Mackenzie opened gifts that cost more than my medical school tuition. I remember one specific Thanksgiving where she arrived in a custom-tailored white wool coat that cost $9,000, complaining about the turbulence on her first-class flight from JFK, while I had driven 18 hours in a beat-up Honda Civic with a cracked windshield because I couldn't afford the holiday airfare. During dinner, my father toasted to Mackenzie's growing influence in the fashion world, barely acknowledging my presence until he made a derogatory comment about the bags under my eyes and how I was letting the family down by looking so haggard in front of their guests. I sat there, cutting my turkey with the precision of a surgeon, and realized that these people were no longer my family. They were a collection of high-priced strangers who happened to share my DNA. Every time Mackenzie laughed, a high, tinkling sound that reminded me of breaking glass, I thought about the thousands of dollars our father had spent on her smile, her skin, and her hair, while he had told me that my broken heater was character building. I realized then that the platinum child was a gilded cage, and although I was living in a cell of poverty and exhaustion, I was the only one who actually knew how to survive in the real world. I looked at my father's hands, soft and manicured, and then at my own, which were calloused and stained with the faint, lingering scent of latex and iodine. And I knew that when the world eventually demanded something real, they would all come crawling to the stain on the family name. There were moments in that 380-square-foot apartment when I would stare at the ceiling and wonder if I was the crazy one for choosing the path of most resistance, especially when a single apology to my father would have opened the vault to a life of ease. I could have had the penthouse, the watches, and the summers in the Mediterranean if I had just agreed to drop medicine and work in his marketing department, becoming another cog in the sterling machine of vanity. But every time I saw a patient's heart start beating again under my fingers, or felt the weight of a life saved in the quiet aftermath of a successful surgery, the Soho penthouse felt like a prison of triviality. I became obsessed with the technical details of my craft, spending my few hours of sleep dreaming of arterial grafts and neurosurgical shunts, because I knew that knowledge was the only currency my father couldn't take away from me. I watched from the sidelines as Mackenzie's lifestyle consultancy began to fail because she lacked the discipline to actually work, leading to our father bailing her out with another $500,000 investment that she immediately squandered on a series of luxury retreats in Bali. It was a cycle of entitlement and enabling that made my stomach turn, yet I stayed silent, collecting my certifications and my scars, waiting for the inevitable moment when the sterling bubble would burst and they would realize that you cannot pay rent on a life with nothing but social media likes and inherited arrogance. By the end of 2018, I had stopped reaching out entirely, opting to spend my Christmas morning in the hospital cafeteria, eating a dry turkey sandwich with the janitorial staff, rather than sitting at a table where my worth was measured by the price of my watch. I was 31, I was broke, I was exhausted, and I was the most dangerous person in that family because I was the only one who didn't need them to exist. The gap between us was no longer just a canyon of money, it was a canyon of character. And while Mackenzie was decorating her penthouse with hollow gold, I was tempering my soul in the fire of a 1,000-hour work year, preparing for a day that I knew was coming, a day when the platinum child would finally break and the failure would be the only one left standing with a scalpel in her hand. I kept a meticulous ledger in my head of every slight, every lifestyle expense of Mackenzie's that was touted as an achievement, and every medical textbook I bought instead of a warm meal. I remember buying a second-hand copy of Schwartz's Principles of Surgery for $200 and feeling a surge of adrenaline that Mackenzie probably felt when she bought a new pair of Louboutins, because that book represented a step away from their control and a step toward my autonomy. My father's house in Aspen was a monument to his ego, filled with art he didn't understand and wine he only drank because of the label, and I realized that my tiny, freezing apartment was actually a sanctuary of truth where no one could lie to me about who I was. I stopped answering the few texts I got from my mother, who would send me photos of Mackenzie at various charity galas with captions about how proud she was of her daughters, carefully ignoring the fact that I wasn't in any of the photos and hadn't been invited to the galas. I was the secret shame, the daughter who chose blood and bone over glass and steel, and I leaned into that identity until it became a suit of armor that no insult from Julian Sterling could pierce. I worked until my eyes were perpetually bloodshot. I studied until the anatomy of the human body was more familiar to me than the layout of my childhood home, and I waited for the world to flip on its axis. I knew that the Sterling name was a facade, a thin layer of gold leaf over a crumbling structure, and that while Mackenzie was spending $62,000 on a weekend of temporary pleasure, I was spending every second of my life becoming the kind of woman who could stare death in the eye and not blink. I was Harper Sterling, and in the silence of my walk-up apartment, I was becoming the person who would eventually have to decide if the family that discarded me was worth saving when their luck finally ran out and their gold turned to lead in their mouths. My father's favorite daughter was a consultant of style, but I was becoming a consultant of survival, and the price of my services was something they could never afford with a wire transfer or a Patek Philippe watch. I was the one who knew the exact cost of a heartbeat, the exact pressure of a suture, and the exact weight of a betrayal that had lasted for 6 years. And as I walked into the hospital for another 30-hour shift, I knew that the canyon between us was finally wide enough that they could never cross it without my permission. My name is Harper Sterling, and while most people mark the beginning of their lives by their birth dates, I mark the true beginning of mine at exactly 8:22 p.m. on the night of October 12th, 2018, which was the moment I ceased to exist in the eyes of the Sterling dynasty. We were gathered at the grand ballroom of the St. Regis in Aspen for the annual Autumn Heritage Gala, an event where the air is thick with the scent of expensive Joe Malone candles, aged mahogany, and the silent, predatory judgment of 85 of the most elite families in the state of Colorado. I was standing near the buffet table, feeling entirely out of place in a 3-year-old dress I had painstakingly steamed in my cramped apartment, when the atmosphere in the room shifted from polite murmurs to a vacuum of horrified silence. My sister Mackenzie, the woman who had spent her entire life being polished into a diamond by my father's checkbook, stepped into the center of the parquet floor with the calculated grace of a seasoned performer preparing for her final act. She wasn't just holding a glass of champagne, she was holding a manila envelope that contained the weapon she had spent months forging to ensure I would never be allowed back into the warmth of our father's shadow. In a voice that was perfectly pitched to carry to every corner of the vaulted ceiling, she announced to the room that she had discovered the reason for my recent financial struggles and my sudden distance from the family. She claimed with a trembling, theatrical lip that I had systematically embezzled $95,000 from our mother's private trust fund over the last 18 months to cover what she described as spiraling and uncontrollable gambling debts. To my horror, she didn't just make the accusation. She began circulating a series of forged bank statements printed on high-quality stationery that mimicked the official letterhead of J.P. Morgan Chase, showing a trail of unauthorized wire transfers that ended in a fictitious offshore account linked to my name. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral, like a physical wave of heat crashing against my chest as 85 pairs of eyes, framed by designer eyewear and expensive surgical enhancements, turned toward me with a collective expression of disgust. I looked toward my father, Julian Sterling, hoping to see a flicker of doubt or a desire for the truth, but instead, I found a man who had already reached a verdict without hearing a single word of my defense. He was standing near the fireplace, his hand wrapped around a heavy crystal tumbler containing $300 worth of Macallan 25-year-old scotch, and his face was a mask of such profound, icy fury that I felt the breath leave my lungs. He didn't ask me to explain the documents, and he didn't pull me aside to discuss the matter in private like a father who actually cared about his daughter's soul would have done. Instead, he raised his voice until it boomed over the soft jazz playing in the background, calling me a common thief and a parasite in front of every business associate, rival, and friend he had ever known. He shouted that I was a disgrace to the Sterling name and that my presence was a rot that he was finally cutting out of his life to save what little reputation the family had left after my supposed crimes. I turned to my mother, Evelyn, pleading with my eyes for some sign of the woman who used to read me bedtime stories. But she simply looked down at her $10,000 black Dior clutch, adjusting the clasp with a trembling finger and refusing to meet my gaze, as if looking at me would somehow stain her own pristine social standing. She allowed the silence to become her answer, choosing the comfort of her husband's wealth and the lies of her favorite daughter over the daughter who was currently being metaphorically executed in the middle of a ballroom. I remember the sound of the ice clinking against the glass in my father's hand as he pointed toward the heavy oak exit doors and told me to leave and never return, promising that he would have the security team at our estate pack my remaining belongings into trash bags and leave them at the curb by sunrise. I didn't scream, and I didn't try to snatch the forged papers out of Mackenzie's hand to prove they were fakes, because in that moment, I realized that the truth was irrelevant to these people. They wanted a villain to justify their neglect, and Mackenzie had given them a masterpiece. I walked out of that ballroom with my head held as high as my trembling neck would allow, the sound of their resumed whispers trailing behind me like the buzzing of flies on a carcass. When I pushed through the heavy, gold-leafed doors of the street, Regis, I was met with a torrential Colorado downpour that turned the world into a gray, blurring mess of cold water and shadow. I didn't have a coat, and I certainly didn't have the money for a taxi, so I began to walk through the rain, my cheap satin heels soaking through within minutes until they felt like lead weights attached to my feet. I stopped at a glowing blue ATM on the corner of Cooper Avenue, my fingers numbing as I punched in my PIN, hoping against hope that maybe I had miscalculated my remaining funds from my last paycheck. The screen flickered to life, the harsh white light reflecting off the raindrops on the plastic casing, and displayed the total that would become the foundation of my new, isolated life. Exactly $14.27. That was the entirety of my net worth, while my father sat a few blocks away in a room filled with millions of dollars of art, celebrating the expulsion of the daughter he had decided was a thief. I stood in the rain for a long time, the water running down the back of my neck and soaking into the silk of my dress, and I felt a strange, terrifying sense of lightness wash over me as the realization set in that I truly had nothing left to lose. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a final notification from the family's group chat showing that I had been removed by the administrator, followed by a text from my father stating that he had already contacted the dean of my medical school to warn them about my character. The level of his cruelty was calculated to be absolute, a total scorched earth policy designed to ensure that I would not only be homeless and penniless, but also professionally ruined before I even had the chance to start my career. I looked at the $14.27 on the screen, and I made a silent, freezing vow to the puddles at my feet that I would survive this, not for the sake of the Sterling name, but to prove that the person they had discarded was the only one in that entire bloodline who was actually made of something stronger than paper and gin. I began the long 4-mile walk back to my freezing walk-up apartment, my breath coming in ragged gasps of cold air, knowing that tomorrow I would wake up in a world where I was officially an orphan of choice. Every step I took through the mud and the dark was a step away from the girl who craved their approval and toward the woman who would eventually learn how to stitch her own heart back together with the same precision she would one day use on a surgical table. The walk was a grueling journey of self-reflection, where every insult spat by my father and every smug smirk from Mackenzie played on a loop in my mind, fueling a fire that the rain couldn't extinguish. I thought about the $95,000 Mackenzie had lied about, realizing that she had likely spent that exact amount on her recent trip to the Amalfi Coast and needed a scapegoat to cover the discrepancy in our mother's ledger. The sheer brilliance of her betrayal was that it used my own poverty against me. To the wealthy guests in that room, the idea that a struggling, overworked resident would steal to pay off debts was far more believable than the idea that a platinum child would lie to protect her allowance. By the time I reached the front door of my crumbling building, my dress was ruined, my shoes were falling apart, and my skin was a pale, mottled blue from the cold. But my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I went upstairs, sat on the floor of my kitchen because I didn't even own a chair, and I looked at my hands. The only things my father couldn't take from me, the only things Mackenzie couldn't forge, and the only things that would eventually earn me a life they could never understand. I didn't cry that night because tears felt like a waste of the precious energy I needed to figure out how to stretch $14 across the next 2 weeks of my life. Instead, I sat in the dark and listened to the rain hitting the window, the sound of the world washing away the Harper Sterling who had been a victim and leaving behind the Harper Sterling who would become a survivor. There is a specific kind of clarity that comes with total, absolute loss, a shedding of the ego that allows you to see the people around you for exactly who they are without the filter of hope or love. That night, at 8:22 p.m., my father didn't just lose a daughter. He lost his only connection to reality, and Mackenzie didn't just win a social battle. She cemented her own eventual downfall by proving she was willing to destroy her own flesh and blood for a line of credit. I realized that my mother's refusal to look at me was the ultimate confirmation that our relationship had always been a transaction based on my ability to make her look like a good parent, a role I was no longer interested in playing. I was 31 years old. I was standing at the absolute bottom of a mountain I would have to climb alone, and for the first time in my life, the air didn't smell like my father's expensive scotch or my sister's French perfume. It smelled like freedom. I took my ruined dress off, laid it in the trash bin, and went to bed on my thin mattress, dreaming not of the life I had lost, but of the white coat I would eventually earn, a coat that would never be stained by the lies of a girl named Mackenzie or the judgment of a man named Julian. I was no longer a Sterling of Aspen. I was a woman with $14.27, a broken heart, and a resolve that was about to become the most dangerous thing the Sterling family had ever encountered. The point of no return was supposed to be my ending, but as the sun began to rise over the wet streets of Colorado the next morning, I knew it was actually my prologue, the moment when the stain on the family name decided to become the masterpiece they would one day beg to be associated with again. I walked to the hospital for my shift that morning, the hunger in my stomach secondary to the cold, hard determination in my chest, knowing that the journey from $14 to a lead trauma surgeon would be paved with the very grit my father thought I lacked. Every second of that night is burned into my soul, a reminder that the people who should have loved me most were the ones who were willing to throw me into the storm for the sake of a forged bank statement and a glass of aged whiskey. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary, but for me, it was a courtroom where I was convicted of being inconvenient, and the only way to appeal the sentence was to build a life so magnificent that their rejection would become the greatest mistake of their lives. I didn't need their trust fund, and I didn't need their estate. I just needed to survive until the day when the truth finally walked into the room without knocking, and I was the only one with the power to decide if I would listen. The rain was still hammering against the reinforced glass windows of the 24-hour Mountain View diner on the outskirts of Aspen when I finally slumped into a torn vinyl booth at 2:45 a.m., my clothes still heavy and damp from the walk and my skin smelling like a mix of cheap industrial grease, wet pavement, and the bitter metallic scent of my own regret. The diner was nearly empty, occupied only by a long-haul trucker nursing a mug of lukewarm coffee and a tired waitress whose name tag said Shirley, and the harsh yellow glow of the overhead fluorescent lights made the world outside look like an impenetrable wall of ink. I felt a strange, hollow vibration in my chest as I reached for a blue ballpoint pen that was sitting next to a stack of napkins and pulled a paper placemat toward me, the kind that had a faded map of local tourist attractions printed on it in grainy ink. I didn't use the map. I flipped it over to the blank white side and began to conduct a cold, surgical audit of my life, calculating my worth not in the millions of dollars that my father, Julian Sterling, controlled, but in the raw, undeniable skill that resided in my own 2 hands. I looked at my fingers, still pale from the mountain chill, and realized that while the Sterling family had spent 31 years loving the carefully curated idea of me as a decorative asset to their social standing, they fundamentally hated the reality of my independence and the fact that I had chosen a profession that dealt with the visceral truth of human mortality rather than the polished lies of real estate. On that cheap paper placemat, I wrote down a list of my assets: a nearly completed residency, an exhaustive knowledge of human anatomy, a high tolerance for sleep deprivation, and a heart that had finally been hardened into something as durable as surgical steel. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock behind the counter marking the seconds as I realized that the $14.27 in my checking account was actually the price of my freedom from a dynasty that had never truly seen me. I made a silent, solemn vow to the chipped ceramic mug of coffee in front of me that I would never again answer a call from the 970 area code, and I would never again seek the approval of a man who could be swayed by a forged bank statement and a socialite's theatrical tears. I decided in that moment that I would disappear into the grueling, anonymous world of trauma surgery, treating my career not as a path to a paycheck, but as a military operation designed to build a fortress that no Sterling could ever breach. I didn't shed a single tear as I scratched out the names of my parents and my sister on that placemat, watching the blue ink bleed into the cheap fibers, because I knew that tears were a luxury for people who still had something left to lose. I was starting from absolute zero, a ghost in my own hometown, but as I signaled Shirley to bring me the $6 late-night breakfast special of eggs, burnt toast, and watery hash browns, I felt a surge of predatory focus that I had never experienced under the Swarovski chandeliers of the Sterling estate. I ate that meal with a methodical, rhythmic intensity, savoring the salty, greasy reality of it, because it was the first thing I had ever truly owned without a string of my father's influence attached to it. I spent the next hour mapping out the next 5 years of my life with the precision of a master architect, detailing the certifications I would earn, the extra shifts I would volunteer for, and the bridges I would systematically burn until there was nothing left of the girl who had walked into the St. Regis ballroom earlier that night. I knew that Julian Sterling expected me to come crawling back within 48 hours, begging for a loan or a place to stay once the cold reality of my bank balance set in. But he didn't understand that he had accidentally given me the greatest gift a person can receive, the knowledge that I could survive the worst thing he could possibly do to me. The planning session on the back of that placemat became my manifesto, a document that prioritized autonomy over comfort and competence over inheritance, and I felt my pulse steady into the calm, slow beat of a surgeon who has already stabilized the patient. By the time the sun began to cast a bruised purple light over the peaks of the Rockies, I had filled every square inch of that paper with a strategy for total self-reliance, identifying the hospitals in Seattle and Chicago that would value my work ethic more than my pedigree. I realized that my sister Mackenzie's attempt to ruin me had actually stripped away the only thing that was holding me back, which was the lingering, desperate hope that my family might one day love me for who I actually was. With that hope gone, I was more dangerous than I had ever been, because a person with no expectations and a high level of skill is a force that cannot be bargained with or controlled. I paid for my breakfast with $6 of my $14, leaving a $2 tip for Shirley because I knew what it felt like to work for every cent, and as I walked out of the diner, the air was crisp and smelled of pine and damp earth. I stood in the parking lot and watched a black SUV drive past, likely carrying some wealthy traveler to the private airport, and I didn't feel a shred of envy. I only felt a cold, quiet anticipation for the day when I would be the one holding the power in a room where money couldn't buy a second chance. My father's empire was built on the fickle opinions of the Aspen elite, but the empire I was about to build would be built on the bedrock of medical science and the thousands of lives I would eventually hold in my hands. I walked toward the bus station with my shoulders back, the dampness of my clothes no longer bothering me because I was already mentally miles away, navigating the hallways of a future where the name Sterling was just a word on a white coat and not a chain around my neck. I knew that the path ahead would be filled with more nights in cheap diners and more 100-hour weeks in sterile rooms. But for the first time in my 31 years, I was the one holding the pen. I had calculated my worth, and the result was far higher than the $95,000 Mackenzie had tried to steal from my reputation. My worth was infinite because I was the only person who knew how to put myself back together. I left that diner with a paper placemat folded in my pocket and a plan that would eventually bring the entire Sterling dynasty to its knees, not through a public scandal or a legal battle, but through the simple, devastating act of being successful without them. The drive and the determination that settled into my bones that morning were unlike anything I had ever felt, a sharpening of the senses that happens when you realize that your survival depends entirely on your own intellect and nothing else. I thought about my father's mahogany-paneled office and the way he looked at me with such casual, dismissive cruelty, and I realized that he was a man who only knew how to destroy things he couldn't buy. He thought he had destroyed me, but he had actually just cleared the field so I could build something that would outlast him by decades. I spent the bus ride out of the mountains staring out the window at the high-end boutiques and the five-star hotels, seeing them for the hollow, fragile structures they were, and I felt a profound sense of pity for the people who spent their lives trying to stay inside those gold-leafed walls. I was a surgeon in training, a woman who understood that the most important parts of a human being are the ones you can't see on a bank statement, and that night in the diner was my true residency, the place where I learned how to operate on my own life. I would never answer their calls, and I would never seek their forgiveness, because the silence I was entering was not a punishment. It was a sanctuary where I could become the version of Harper Sterling that they were all too afraid to imagine. As the bus crossed the state line and the mountains began to fade into the rearview mirror, I closed my eyes and visualized the operating room where I would eventually stand, the lights bright, the monitors humming, and the power entirely in my hands. The Sterling name was a stain, but I was going to be the one to scrub it clean, one successful surgery at a time, until the only thing people remembered when they heard it was the doctor who could save anyone, even the sister who had tried to kill her spirit. I was 31 years old. I had $8.27 left in my pocket, and I had never felt more like a queen in my entire life, because I finally knew that the only throne worth having is the one you build with your own bloody, calloused hands. The sound of the bus tires on the highway became a mantra, a steady, pulsing reminder that every mile put between me and Aspen was a mile closer to the independence I had dreamed of since I was a child. I realized that the $95,000 Mackenzie had accused me of stealing was a pittance compared to the value of the education and the resilience I had cultivated in secret, and I felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that her lie would eventually be the very thing that exposed her own emptiness. My father's Scotch and my mother's Dior clutch were the symbols of a world that was already dying, a world that relied on shadows and whispers to maintain its luster, while I was moving toward a world of cold, hard facts and undeniable results. I would never be a failure because I had already survived the failure of the people who were supposed to protect me, and there is no greater strength than the strength of a person who has already walked through the fire and come out the other side with their mind intact. I looked at the placemat again, the blue ink slightly smeared by the humidity, and I saw the blueprint of a life that was honest, brutal, and entirely mine. I didn't need their estate, I didn't need their name, and I certainly didn't need their money. I just needed the chance to prove that a Sterling could be more than just a real estate mogul or a social media consultant. I was going to be a savior, a woman who lived in the gap between life and death. And I was going to do it so well that the world would forget Julian Sterling ever had a second daughter until the day he was forced to remember her. The planning was complete, the operation was underway, and as I watched the first true rays of the sun hit the flat, open plains of the Midwest, I knew that the Sterling family's reign over my heart had officially ended at 2:45 a.m. in a diner that smelled like cheap grease and ultimate unshakable victory. I was Harper Sterling, lead trauma surgeon in the making, and I was finally, for the very first time, completely and beautifully alone. 5 years of my life vanished into the sterile, high-pressure vacuum of the emergency department, a period during which the girl who stood shivering in the rain outside the St. Regis was replaced by a woman the staff at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle came to call the Ice Queen of the ER. My name is Harper Sterling, and by the age of 36, I had built a reputation that was as sharp and uncompromising as the German-engineered surgical instruments I used every single day to pull broken bodies back from the brink of extinction. While my father and sister were living in the delusional comfort of their Aspen bubble, I was existing in a world where the only thing that mattered was the cold, hard efficiency of a successful intervention. And I applied that same clinical precision to the task of dismantling the lies that had been used to exhume me from my own family. I didn't spend those 5 years wallowing in the injustice of my exile. Instead, I treated the betrayal as a complicated pathology that required a systematic, evidence-based cure, and I spent every spare moment and every dollar of my hard-earned lead surgeon salary building a silent, devastating arsenal of facts. I lived a life of deliberate, calculated austerity, residing in a modern but minimalist glass-walled apartment in downtown Seattle that looked more like a command center than a home. And it was from there that I orchestrated the investigation into the Sterling dynasty's golden child. I quietly hired a top-tier forensic accountant, a man who charged $900 an hour and specialized in uncovering the kind of white-collar rot that people like my father Julian Sterling assumed was buried too deep for anyone to ever find. The results of that investigation were more explosive than I had ever dared to imagine, revealing that Mackenzie had not just framed me for a single theft of $95,000, but had been systematically siphoned a staggering $8,400 every single month from our father's primary commercial real estate business accounts for over 4 years. My forensic expert uncovered a labyrinth of shell companies and falsified expense reports that Mackenzie had used to fund a life of obscene luxury, while she publicly played the role of the devoted, hard-working daughter who was carrying the weight of her failure sister's disgrace. I spent my nights after 18-hour shifts meticulously cataloging the 112 pages of evidence that my team had compiled, a document that included everything from forged signatures on corporate checks to the digital breadcrumbs of a secret lifestyle that would have made even the most jaded socialite blush. The crown jewel of my collection was a series of 4K high-definition security camera clips obtained through a private investigator in France, showing Mackenzie draped in $10,000 worth of Fendi furs, laughing as she swiped our father's emergency titanium credit card at a luxury boutique on the Avenue Montaigne in Paris. At the exact moment that footage was recorded, she had sent a group text to my parents with a photo of a generic mountain sunset, claiming she was at a silent spiritual retreat in the Himalayas to pray for my recovery from addiction. The sheer sociopathic audacity of her deception was a masterpiece of manipulation. But as I uploaded those files into a triple encrypted digital vault that required a biometric scan to open, I felt a sense of calm that was almost predatory in its intensity. I wasn't interested in a petty shouting match or a dramatic confrontation over a holiday dinner. I was interested in the total, indisputable restoration of my truth and the absolute exposure of the rot that had been allowed to flourish in my absence. I watched the videos of her spending my father's money on $5,000 magnums of wine and $30,000 watches, the very same Patek Philippe I had seen on her wrist, and I realized that my sister had been banking on my silence and my poverty to protect her own glass house. She assumed that because I was a stain on the family name, I would never have the resources or the resolve to look back, never suspecting that the sister she had discarded was now a high-stakes trauma surgeon who dealt with hidden internal bleeding for a living. I treated the investigation like a complex surgery, identifying the source of the hemorrhage and preparing the clamps, waiting for the perfect anatomical moment to make the first incision. Every time I had to deal with a difficult patient or a grueling night in the trauma bay, I would think about that digital vault and the 112 pages of truth it contained, and it would give me the strength to keep my face a mask of professional indifference. I became a master of the long game, ignoring the occasional toxic email from my mother about healing through forgiveness, while I was simultaneously watching the evidence of her favorite daughter's grand larceny grow more undeniable with every passing month. The forensic accountant showed me how Mackenzie had used our mother's trust fund as a revolving door for her gambling debts, which were actually quite real, but they were hers, not mine. She had simply projected her own vices onto me to ensure that if the money ever went missing, the blame would fall on the daughter who was already an outsider. She had spent nearly $400,000 of the family's wealth on high-stakes online poker and luxury travel, all while my father was bragging to his business associates about her impeccable financial intuition and her role as his successor. I sat in my quiet apartment, the blue light of my laptop screen reflecting in my eyes, and I felt a profound sense of irony in the fact that Julian Sterling, the man who prided himself on being a visionary in the real estate market, was being systematically robbed by the only person he actually trusted. I had records of every flight she took on the private jet under the guise of business meetings that were actually weekend trysts in the Maldives, and I had the receipts for the designer furniture she had shipped to a secret apartment in Chelsea that our father didn't even know existed. I was the silent observer of their downfall, the ghost in the machine who was documenting the slow, expensive suicide of the Sterling reputation. And I held the power to end the charade with a single click of a mouse. In the hospital, I was the one who made the hard calls, the one who told families that their loved ones weren't coming home, and that experience had stripped away any lingering traces of sentimentality that might have made me hesitate. I looked at the 4K footage of Mackenzie's face, her eyes bright with greed, her mouth curved in a smug, untouchable smile, and I didn't see my sister. I saw a malignant growth that needed to be excised before it destroyed the entire organism. I kept my arsenal of facts locked away, a cold and heavy weight in the back of my mind, knowing that the point of no return I had crossed in the rain 5 years ago was about to be revisited by the rest of my family. I had become the Ice Queen not because I was cold, but because I was tempered, a woman who had been forged in the fire of absolute betrayal and cooled in the lonely solitude of self-made success. My father's $4.5 million estate in Aspen was a castle built on the sand of Mackenzie's lies, and I was the rising tide that was about to wash it all away. I had the bank statements, the security footage, the sworn affidavits from former boutique employees, and a forensic audit that was so thorough it could have been used in a federal court of law. I was no longer the girl with $14.27 in her pocket. I was a lead trauma surgeon with a digital vault full of vengeance and a heart that no longer beat for the approval of Julian Sterling. Every page of those 112 documents was a testament to my survival and a record of the price my family had paid for their arrogance and their lack of faith in me. I would often sit in my office at the hospital, looking out at the gray Seattle skyline, and imagine the look on my father's face when he realized that the daughter he called a failure was the only one who actually knew how to protect the Sterling name, by burning it down to the ground and starting over with the truth. I knew that Mackenzie was getting bolder, her thefts increasing in frequency and scale as she realized our father's cognitive decline was beginning to make him a more vulnerable target, and I waited with the predatory patience of a surgeon for the moment when the crisis would finally force their hand. I was ready. My evidence was airtight and my resolve was absolute, a diamond-hard certainty that the truth would be the last thing my sister ever expected to see from me. The digital vault was a reminder that while you can buy silence and you can buy a reputation, You cannot buy your way out of a factual reality once someone with enough skill and enough time decides to uncover it. I was Harper Sterling, and I had spent 5 years becoming the most dangerous person my family had ever encountered. The one who remembered everything, the one who documented everything, and the one who was finally ready to settle the debt that had been growing since that rainy night in 2018. The arsenal was complete, the strategy was set, and the Ice Queen was simply waiting for the first sign of a crack in the Sterling armor to unleash the one thing they feared more than poverty: the absolute, unvarnished 4K resolution truth. I thought about the night at the diner, the smell of grease and the blue ink on the paper placemat, and I realized that my vow had been fulfilled beyond my wildest dreams, not just because I was successful, but because I was prepared. I had become the architect of a counter-operation that was so sophisticated it would make my father's business dealings look like child's play, and I felt a grim, silent satisfaction in the knowledge that I was the one who held the keys to their future. Mackenzie's $8,400 a month was a slow-motion heist that I had allowed to continue only until the total amount was large enough to ensure her permanent legal and social ruin, a threshold that we had officially crossed 3 months ago. I had the evidence of her forging my mother's signature on a change of beneficiary form for a life insurance policy, a move so desperate and so illegal that it would carry a mandatory prison sentence if I chose to involve the authorities. I wasn't just a surgeon of bodies anymore. I was a surgeon of lives, and I was about to perform the most important operation of my career, one that would remove the cancer of my sister's greed and the blindness of my father's pride in one swift, clean motion. The 112 pages were my scalpel, the digital vault was my operating room, and the Sterling family was the patient on the table, unaware that their life support was currently being managed by the daughter they had left for dead in the rain. I was ready for the phone call I knew was coming, the call that would signal that the golden child had finally pushed the dynasty too far, and when that phone finally rang, I wouldn't be the one begging for a seat at the table. I would be the one deciding who was allowed to remain in the room, and I would do it with the same cold, unwavering focus that had made me the best surgeon in the Pacific Northwest. The 5 years of silence were over, the arsenal was primed, and as I looked at the biometric scanner on my vault, I knew that the Sterling name was about to be redefined one last time, not by a real estate mogul or a lifestyle consultant, but by the lead trauma surgeon who had learned how to turn a betrayal into a masterpiece of justice. The setup for the final confrontation of my life occurred on a Tuesday night at exactly 11:34 p.m., a time when the rest of the world was sleeping, but the trauma bay of Harborview Medical Center was vibrating with the high-voltage tension of a code-red emergency. I was standing at the central nursing station, reviewing the digital charts of 3 stable post-op patients, when the emergency radio crackled to life with a frantic report from the paramedics describing a high-speed vehicular catastrophe involving a white 2024 Mercedes-AMG GT that had lost control on a rain-slicked curve and struck a reinforced steel guardrail at an estimated 95 miles per hour. The description of the vehicle sent a cold, familiar dread pooling at the base of my spine. But as the lead trauma surgeon on call, I had long ago trained my heart to function with the mechanical indifference of a clock, and I immediately began barking orders to the trauma team to prepare for a massive internal hemorrhage and potential neurosurgical intervention. When the automatic glass doors of the ambulance bay hissed open and the gurney was rushed inside by 4 breathless EMTs, I didn't see a patient. I saw the twisted, bloody wreckage of the Sterling legacy lying on a thin mattress, her face obscured by a plastic oxygen mask and her designer silk dress shredded by the force of the seatbelt and the glass. It was Mackenzie, the platinum child, the sister who had siphoned thousands of dollars from our father's accounts and framed me for her crimes, now reduced to a series of crashing vitals and thready pulses that were barely clinging to the edge of existence. I stepped into the trauma bay with my hands held high in sterile gloves, my face hidden behind a blue surgical mask and a plastic splash shield, and for the next 4 hours, I existed only as a set of highly trained eyes and a pair of hands capable of mending what the world had broken. While I was inside the operating room, meticulously suturing a grade 4 liver laceration and stabilizing a shattered femur, my parents were pacing the sterile linoleum of the surgical waiting room, a space that smelled of burnt coffee and stagnant desperation. I could hear the muffled echoes of my father's voice through the double doors, a sound that hadn't changed in 5 years, authoritative, impatient, and laced with the assumption that the world existed solely to cater to his whims. When I finally stepped out of the OR at 3:15 a.m., my scrubs were heavily stained with the dark, copper-scented blood of the sister who had tried to erase me, and my body was vibrating with the physical exhaustion that comes from playing God for 4 hours straight. My father, Julian Sterling, saw the white coat and the lead surgeon insignia and immediately lunged toward me, his face a mask of frantic, entitled rage as he began to bark orders like I was a junior associate at his real estate firm instead of the woman holding his daughter's life in her hands. He demanded to know why the surgery had taken so long. He demanded the names of the best private specialists in the country, and he told me in a voice that was thick with arrogance that I was to spare no expense because he was a man of significant means who did not tolerate incompetence in his presence. He didn't even look at my eyes. He looked at the badge on my chest, but the fluorescent lights were reflecting off my splash shield so intensely that he couldn't see the face of the daughter he had discarded in the rain 5 years ago. I stood there in the deafening silence of the hallway, listening to him treat me like a servant, and I felt a profound, chilling sense of calm as I slowly reached up and pulled the surgical mask down, revealing the face he hadn't seen since the night of the $95,000 lie. The silence that followed was so absolute that I could hear the hum of the vending machine 50 feet away and the frantic, shallow breathing of my mother, Evelyn, who had stopped mid-sob as her eyes locked onto mine. My father's mouth remained open, the next demand dying in his throat as the recognition hit him with the force of a physical blow. His gaze darting from my face to the name Dr. Harper Sterling embroidered on my scrubs and back again. He looked as if he had seen a ghost, his skin turning a sickly mottled gray under the harsh hospital lighting, and for the first time in 36 years, the great Julian Sterling was utterly speechless in the presence of his eldest daughter. My mother's hand flew to her throat, her expensive diamond rings glinting as she whispered my name with a mixture of horror and a sudden, pathetic hope that made my stomach turn with disgust. I didn't move toward them, and I didn't offer a word of comfort. I simply stood my ground, a wall of professional competence and personal coldness that they had spent half a decade building through their own neglect and cruelty. The air in the hallway was thick with the weight of 5 years of silence, 5 years of missed birthdays, and the crushing reality that the person they needed most was the one they had deemed a stain on their reputation. My father tried to step forward, his hand trembling as he reached out as if to touch my arm, but I maintained the 3 feet of distance that my medical training required and my self-respect demanded. I informed them in a voice that was as flat and clinical as a heart monitor that Mackenzie was stable but remained in critical condition, and that her survival was due entirely to the speed and precision of the surgical team he had just insulted. I watched as he processed the fact that he was currently standing in a facility where his millions of dollars meant nothing and my skill meant everything, a reversal of power so total and so poetic that I could almost feel the ghost of the girl from the 24-hour diner smiling in the background. My father cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of his former authority, and asked if we could go to a private office to discuss the misunderstanding that had occurred in Aspen, but I looked him directly in the eye and told him that I didn't have a private office for him, only a waiting room for the families of my patients. I told him that I was currently the lead trauma surgeon on duty, and that my responsibility was to the clinical outcomes of the 24 people in my ward, not to the social or emotional repair of a man who had declared me dead to save his own vanity. The expression on my mother's face was one of profound, dawning realization as she looked at the blood on my sleeves and understood that her favorite daughter's life had been sustained by the very blood she had claimed was tainted. She began to stammer an apology, something about how they had missed me and how they had always known I would be successful. But the lies were so transparent and so desperate that they didn't even warrant a response. I reminded them that the last time we spoke, my father had changed the security codes on a $4.5 million estate and blocked my number, and I informed them that while the hospital was a public space, my life remained a fortress to which they no longer held the keys. I saw the way my father's shoulders slumped, the Brioni coat he was wearing suddenly looking too large for his shrinking frame, and I realized that the power he had used to crush me was entirely dependent on my willingness to be hurt by him. Without that willingness, he was just an elderly man in a hallway, clutching a designer briefcase and waiting for news about a daughter who had been robbing him blind for years. I didn't tell him about the forensic accountant yet, and I didn't tell him about the 112 pages of evidence sitting in my digital vault. I let him sit in the uncertainty of his daughter's survival and the certainty of his own failure as a parent. The setup was complete. The players were all on the stage, and the deafening silence in that hallway was the sound of a dynasty finally hitting the guardrail at 95 miles per hour. I turned my back on them and walked toward the scrub sink, the sound of my own footsteps echoing with a steady, rhythmic confidence that told me I had finally won a war I never wanted to fight. I washed my hands with the same methodical care I always used, watching the pink-tinged water swirl down the drain, and I realized that the code red hadn't just saved Mackenzie's life. It had finally ended the lie that the Sterling family was something I needed to belong to. I was Harper Sterling, the woman who had built a career out of the wreckage of her own childhood, and as I looked at my reflection in the sterile stainless steel of the sink, I knew that the silence in the hallway was the only apology I would ever need. They were trapped in that waiting room, forced to confront the reality that the platinum child was broken, and the failure was the one who knew how to fix her, a dynamic that no amount of real estate or scotch could ever rectify. I spent the rest of my shift moving through the hospital with a focused intensity, treating every other patient with the same level of care I had given my sister, because my integrity was not a currency that could be devalued by my family's presence. I saw my father through the glass of the waiting room several times, sitting with his head in his hands, looking at his phone as if waiting for a call that would never come, and I felt nothing but a quiet, clinical observation of a man who had finally run out of options. My mother was pacing the small area near the coffee machine, her Dior bag looking absurdly out of place in an environment where the only things that mattered were oxygen saturation and blood pressure. They were tourists in my world, visitors in a land where I was the sovereign, and the realization of their own irrelevance was written in every line of their weary, aging faces. The deafening silence was not just a lack of sound, it was the absence of the power they once held over my heart, a vacuum that I had filled with 5 years of hard work, grit, and the unshakable knowledge of my own worth. As the morning sun began to bleed through the high windows of the hospital, I realized that the code red was the final surgery of my past, the moment where the last remaining ties of expectation and hurt were finally severed by a stainless steel scalpel. I didn't give them another update until the shift change at 7 a.m., and when I did, I kept it brief, professional, and entirely devoid of personal warmth, informing them that Mackenzie would be moved to the ICU and that a different team would be taking over her care. My father tried to stop me one last time, his voice a pathetic shadow of the roar he had used in the St. Regis ballroom, asking me if I would at least come to dinner to talk things through once the crisis had passed. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I told him that I had already made my plans on a paper placemat 5 years ago, and those plans didn't include a seat at his table. I walked away, the squeak of my clogs on the floor the only sound in the corridor, leaving him standing there with his millions and his regrets and the daughter who had betrayed him. The silence was no longer deafening to me. It was the most beautiful music I had ever heard, a symphony of independence that played as I walked out of the hospital and into the crisp, honest light of a new day. I was Dr. Harper Sterling, and I had performed the ultimate trauma surgery. I had saved the life of my enemy, and in doing so, I had finally, permanently, set myself free from the weight of the Sterling name. The execution of my final plan was not a scene of screaming or cinematic histrionics, but rather a clinical, cold-blooded dissection of a family that had spent decades mistaking their own arrogance for actual substance. Once Mackenzie was officially transferred to the intensive care unit and her vitals had plateaued into a fragile but manageable state of stability, because I am a professional who would never allow a personal betrayal to compromise the sanctity of my surgical oath, I led my parents into private consultation room 4B. The room was small, smelling of industrial-strength lemon disinfectant and the stale, recycled air of a hospital that never sleeps, and the harsh, blue-white light of the ceiling panels made my mother's $20,000 facelift look like a brittle porcelain mask that was beginning to crack under the pressure of the night's events. As soon as the heavy, soundproof door clicked shut, my father, Julian Sterling, began to stammer an apology, his voice cracking with a pathetic late bloomer's remorse as he tried to reach for my hand with fingers that were trembling with the realization of his own vulnerability. I did not let him touch me. Instead, I held up my right hand, the same hand that had just spent hours inside his favorite daughter's abdominal cavity, and the silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it was pressing the very oxygen out of the room. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop, a sleek silver machine that contained the digital ghost of every lie Mackenzie had ever told, and I opened the primary encrypted file that had cost me thousands of dollars in forensic accounting fees to assemble. I didn't start with a speech or a list of my grievances, because I knew that in the world of the Sterlings, only cold, hard numbers carried the weight of truth. So I simply turned the screen toward them and began to scroll through the primary spreadsheet of Mackenzie's systematic thefts. I watched my father's eyes widen as he looked at the grand total of $412,000 that had been siphoned from his various commercial real estate accounts over the last 60 months, a figure that represented a slow-motion heist conducted right under his nose while he was busy calling me a failure. I showed them the original transaction logs from October 2018, the digital fingerprints that proved the $95,000 trust fund theft was actually a transfer Mackenzie had made to an offshore gambling site before she forged the bank statements she showed at the St. Regis Gala. I sat there with my back straight, my blood-stained scrubs a stark contrast to their designer wool coats, and I read the numbers aloud in the same flat, rhythmic tone I use to call out a patient's heart rate during a crisis. I showed them the 4K security footage of Mackenzie at the Chanel boutique in Paris, the date and timestamps lining up perfectly with the spiritual retreat photos she had texted them, and I watched as the reality of their own blindness began to sink in like a slow-acting poison. My mother, Evelyn, sat frozen in her chair, her hands clutching her Dior bag so tightly that her knuckles were white, her face practically melting in a mask of profound, sickening shame as she realized that she had traded her eldest daughter for a common thief who happened to wear better shoes. I told them with a voice that was as sharp and sterile as a scalpel that Mackenzie hadn't just lied about me to get me out of the way. She had systematically robbed them blind for half a decade while they cheered her on and treated her like the savior of the Sterling reputation. I explained the mechanics of the shell companies she had created, the way she had forged my father's signature on emergency credit card authorizations, and the cold reality that the platinum child was actually a financial predator who had used their own pride as her primary weapon. Julian tried to interrupt, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple as he realized the sheer scale of the humiliation he had invited into his own home. But I silenced him with a single look and continued to list the dates of every forged check and every unauthorized wire transfer. I pointed out that while I was living on $14.27 and working 100-hour weeks to become a surgeon, they were subsidizing Mackenzie's gambling debts and her secret apartment in Chelsea with money that should have been my inheritance. The room felt smaller with every passing second, the air thickening with the scent of their shattered illusions, and I felt a sense of calm that was almost surgical in its precision as I closed the laptop with a definitive metallic click. I didn't ask them for an apology, and I didn't ask them to make it right, because I knew that the $412,000 was a pittance compared to the 5 years of my life they had stolen with their silence and their judgment. I looked at my mother, who was now weeping into a silk handkerchief, and I told her that the blood on my hands tonight wasn't just Mackenzie's. It was the blood of the daughter they had murdered in their hearts 5 years ago on a rainy night in Aspen. I reminded my father that he had called me a stain on the family name in front of 85 elite guests, and I informed him that the only stain in the room was the one Mackenzie had left on his bank accounts and his ego. I saw the moment his spirit broke, the way his shoulders slumped and his gaze dropped to the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the woman who had just saved his life's work and his daughter's life in the same 12-hour window. I didn't feel a surge of joy or a rush of triumph. I felt the cold, hollow satisfaction of a job well done, the same feeling I get when I successfully close a difficult incision and know that the patient will live to see another morning. I told them that I had already prepared a digital copy of the evidence for the authorities if they chose to pursue criminal charges, but that my involvement in the Sterling family business ended the moment I stepped out of that consultation room. I was no longer interested in their money, their estate, or their desperate last-minute attempts to redefine our history to fit their new, painful reality. The silence that followed was the sound of a dynasty finally collapsing under the weight of its own lies, a quiet, devastating end to 31 years of conditional love and high-priced performance. My father tried to say that they would make it up to me, mentioning a trust fund he wanted to set up in my name as if he could buy back the graduation he skipped or the wedding he wasn't invited to with a single wire transfer. I looked at him and told him that my worth wasn't something he could calculate on a balance sheet anymore, because I had earned my own life in the silence and the cold of a Seattle winter while they were busy being robbed by their favorite child. I stood up, the chair scraping against the linoleum with a harsh, final sound, and I told them that the nurses would keep them updated on Mackenzie's recovery, but that I was going home to the apartment I paid for with my own labor. I walked toward the door, my footsteps steady and certain, and I didn't look back even when I heard my mother call my name in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a very deep, very dark well. I had executed the plan with the same unwavering focus that had made me a lead trauma surgeon, and as I walked out into the cool morning air of the hospital parking lot, I knew that the truth was the only inheritance I ever truly needed. The reality of Mackenzie's betrayal was now a matter of public record within the family, a factual architecture that they would have to live inside for the rest of their lives, and I felt a profound sense of lightness as I realized that the Ice Queen was finally free to melt into the woman I was always meant to be. I had shown them the 112 pages of evidence not because I wanted their money, but because I wanted them to know that the daughter they discarded was the only one who was actually watching over them, even from the shadows of her exile. I thought about the $412,000 and the 4K footage and the forged signatures, and I realized that Mackenzie's greatest mistake wasn't the theft itself, but the assumption that I would never be strong enough to look back at the wreckage she left behind. My parents were left in that small room with their spreadsheets and their shame, while I was walking into a future where the name Sterling was finally synonymous with competence, integrity, and the kind of strength that doesn't need a Swarovski chandelier to shine. The execution was complete, the cancer had been removed, and although the patient would be scarred for life, the truth was, finally, undeniably stable. I drove my 2024 Midnight Black Tesla Model S away from the hospital, the silent engine a perfect accompaniment to the peace in my heart, knowing that the Sterling name finally belonged to the daughter who had the courage to tell the truth. Every detail of that meeting is etched into my mind like a surgical diagram, from the way my father's hands shook as he scrolled through the bank statements to the specific sickly shade of red that crept up his neck as he realized how long he had been played for a fool. I had been a ghost to them for 5 years, but in that consultation room, I became the only solid thing in their universe, a pillar of facts in a world of expensive illusions. I realized that my sister had spent those 5 years building a prison out of stolen money, and tonight I had simply handed my parents the keys and told them it was time to take a look inside. The $412,000 was a heavy price to pay for a lie, but it was nothing compared to the cost of realizing that the daughter you praised was a thief and the daughter you cursed was a savior. I didn't need to raise my voice to destroy them. I just needed to let the numbers do the talking, and the numbers were screaming that the Sterling dynasty was a hollow shell. As I pulled into my driveway and saw the sun reflecting off the glass of my apartment building, I knew that the execution was the most successful surgery I had ever performed, because it had finally removed the last traces of the Sterling family's power over my soul. I was Harper Sterling, and I was finally, beautifully and permanently my own person. The aftermath of my surgical strike against the Sterling dynasty was total, a complete and irreversible dismantling of the power structures that had kept me in exile for 6 long years, and I watched the fallout from the quiet sanctuary of my own life with a clinical detachment that would have made my younger, wounded self shudder with awe. In the weeks following the confrontation in private consultation room 4B, my father, Julian Sterling, made one final desperate attempt to reacquire me as an asset to his bruised ego, showing up at the hospital with a $500,000 peace offering check drawn from his primary business account at Wells Fargo. He stood in the lobby, looking diminished and frail in a charcoal-colored cashmere overcoat that seemed to hang off his shrinking frame, and he held out that slip of paper as if it were a magical talisman that could undo the thousands of hours of loneliness and the freezing nights in my old walk-up apartment. I didn't even look at the signature or the amount for more than a fraction of a second. Instead, I reached out and took the check with a steady hand, only to slowly and methodically tear it into 4 equal pieces while maintaining eye contact with the man who had once told me I was a stain on his name. I dropped the remnants of his $500,000 apology into a nearby trash bin filled with discarded paper towels and empty caffeine shot bottles, and I told him that my forgiveness was not a commodity he could purchase on a payment plan, especially when he was only offering it because his favorite daughter had been caught with her hand in his pocket. I walked away from him for the last time, the automatic doors of the hospital lobby hissing shut behind me like a final curtain, and I felt the last lingering tether to the Sterling fortune snap with a satisfying, silent finality that echoed through the very core of my being. Mackenzie survived her injuries, thanks in large part to the surgical precision I had applied to her broken body, but the life she returned to was a hollowed-out wreckage of the socialite fantasy she had spent years building on a foundation of stolen money and forged documents. Once the full scale of her $412,000 theft was laid bare by my forensic evidence, my father was forced to choose between his pride and his bank account, and for the first time in his life, the financial loss was too great for even his vanity to ignore. He didn't press criminal charges, which was a mercy she didn't deserve, but he did something that was, for Mackenzie, a fate worse than a prison cell. He cut her off entirely, revoking her access to the family trust, canceling her titanium credit cards, and selling the 3,000-square-foot Soho penthouse that had been her primary stage for her lifestyle consultancy lies. My sister, the girl who once spent $62,000 on a single weekend in Ibiza and wore a $42,000 Patek Philippe watch like it was a plastic trinket, is now living in a 400-square-foot studio apartment in a nondescript part of Queens. She is currently working a retail job at a mid-tier department store for $16 an hour, her days spent folded into a polyester uniform while she handles the complaints of people she once would have looked down upon from the balcony of a private yacht. I have heard through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances that she spends her lunch breaks staring at her own old Instagram photos, a digital ghost haunting a life she can no longer afford to even visit, and I feel a profound, cold sense of justice knowing that she is finally experiencing the exact kind of struggle she once used as a weapon against me. As for my parents, I have blocked their numbers permanently, ensuring that the 970 area code can never again penetrate the peace I have spent 5 years cultivating in the rain-washed streets of Seattle. I changed my own security codes, not out of fear, but as a symbolic gesture of the fact that I am now the sole proprietor of my own existence and that no amount of sterling blood grants them entry into my sanctuary. I live in a quiet, minimalist home that looks out over the gray, churning waters of the Puget Sound, a space designed with clean lines and open windows that let in the honest, cold light of the Pacific Northwest. My only true indulgence is a $3,000 La Marzocco Linea Micra espresso machine that sits on my marble kitchen counter, a precision-engineered tool that produces a perfect cup of coffee every morning at 5 a.m. before I head into the hospital for my rounds. Every time I hear the hum of the machine and smell the rich, dark aroma of the beans, I am reminded of the $4 bodega coffee that was once my only luxury, and I savor the taste of a life that was built on the bedrock of my own skill rather than the shifting sands of an inheritance. My home is a drama-free zone where the only voices I hear are those of my friends, my colleagues, and the silence of a conscience that is as clear and sterile as a freshly opened surgical pack. I have become the woman I planned to be on that paper placemat in the 24-hour diner, a lead trauma surgeon who is respected for her hands and her mind rather than her last name, and the sterling legacy is now nothing more than a footnote in a story that I am finally the one telling. The sterling name still carries weight in certain circles in Aspen and New York, but for me, it is just a sequence of letters on a driver's license, a relic of a past life that has no more power over me than a ghost. I spend my days navigating the high-stakes world of trauma, pulling people back from the edge of the abyss, and knowing that my value is absolute and undeniable, a fact that no forged bank statement or socialite's whisper can ever diminish. I look at my hands every morning, the same hands that my father once dismissed as a hobbyist's tools, and I realize that they are the most valuable assets I will ever own, capable of mending hearts and dismantling dynasties with equal precision. My father's estate, with its Swarovski chandeliers and its mahogany-paneled offices, feels like a dollhouse compared to the vast, complex reality of the world I inhabit now, a world where the only thing that matters is what you can do when the monitors start screaming and the clock is ticking. I have no regrets about the path I took or the bridges I burned to get here, because those bridges were made of paper and lies, and the fire that consumed them was the only thing that could have truly set me free. I am Harper Sterling, and I am the architect of a life that is honest, brutal, and entirely my own, a masterpiece of survival that was forged in the fire of betrayal and tempered in the cold, quiet victory of the aftermath. My mother still tries to send the occasional handwritten letter to the hospital, filled with vague platitudes about family and the passage of time, but I drop them into the shredder without opening them, the rhythmic whir of the machine a much more pleasant sound than the echoes of her excuses. She chose her Dior bag and her social standing over her daughter's truth, and that is a decision that carries a permanent, non-negotiable price tag in the economy of my heart. Julian has retreated further into his business, becoming a recluse in the very estate he once used to imprison me with his expectations. A man who has all the money in the world, but no one left to leave it to, who hasn't already proven they are willing to steal it from him. The platinum child was a false currency that left him bankrupt in every way that matters, and I am the failure who ended up with the only wealth worth having. The absolute, unshakable knowledge of who I am and what I am capable of achieving. I sit on my balcony in the evenings, watching the ferries cross the Sound and the lights of Seattle flicker to life, and I feel a sense of completion that no trust fund could ever provide. I have performed the ultimate operation on my own life, removing the toxicity of my past and closing the wound so tightly that not even a scar remains, leaving only the smooth, strong surface of a woman who knows exactly how to save herself. Family isn't something that is born in a ballroom or a mahogany office, and it certainly isn't something that can be maintained through a wire transfer or a forged signature on a J.P. Morgan letterhead. Family is the group of people who show up when the rain is pouring and the bank account is at $14. The people who don't ask for a spreadsheet of your worth before they offer you a seat at their table. I have found that family in the nurses I work with, the residents I mentor, and the patients who look into my eyes and see a savior instead of a stain. My father's check for $500,000 was a joke because he thought he was buying my silence, but he didn't realize that my voice had become far more valuable than his money the moment I stopped using it to beg for his love. The aftermath is not just about the fall of the Sterlings, it is about the rise of Harper. A woman who understands that the greatest revenge is not seeing your enemies fail, but seeing yourself succeed so spectacularly that their opinions become as irrelevant as the weather in a city you no longer live in. I have earned my quiet home, my $3,000 espresso machine, and my surgical career through a level of grit that Mackenzie couldn't even imagine in her most desperate retail-fueled nightmares. The story of the Sterling family is a cautionary tale about what happens when you value appearances over people, a lesson that my father and sister had to learn the hard way through the wreckage of a Mercedes-AMG GT and a 112-page forensic audit. I am done being the character in their drama, the scapegoat they use to justify their own emptiness, and I am finally the author of my own narrative, a story that begins and ends with the truth. I look at the 4 pieces of the check in the trash can one last time before the janitorial staff empties it, and I feel a profound sense of peace knowing that I have finally balanced the ledger. The debt is paid, the case is closed, and the lead trauma surgeon is going to sleep with the windows open, listening to the sound of the rain and the honest, steady beat of a heart that belongs only to itself. I am Harper Sterling. I am 36 years old, and I have never been more successful, more powerful, or more beautifully alone than I am right now in the quiet aftermath of my own liberation. The Sterling dynasty died at 8:22 p.m. in 2018, but I was born at 2:45 a.m. in a diner that smelled like grease and victory, and that is the only anniversary I will ever care to celebrate. My life is minimalist because I no longer need the clutter of other people's lies to feel full, and my home is quiet because I have finally silenced the voices that told me I wasn't enough. I have come out on top not by descending to their level, but by rising so high that I can no longer even see the bottom of the canyon where they are still struggling to understand where it all went wrong. My name is on the charts of survivors, and that is the only place it ever needed to be.